I was examining discharge records from orphanages and children's homes in the mid-1870s, tracking what happened to institutionalized children after they left care, adoption rates, aging out, transfers to other institutions, reunification with families, standard outcomes that institutions documented. And I found a category of discharge that appeared frequently in records from 1874 specifically, relocated. Not adopted, which had specific legal procedures and documentation, not transferred to another named institution, not returned to family, just relocated. The term appeared in discharge logs across multiple institutions in different states: Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Illinois. Children who had been in institutional care were discharged, and their status was recorded simply as relocated, with minimal additional information about where they were relocated to or why. An orphanage in upstate New York discharged 27 children between June and October 1874, all with the notation relocated per arrangement. An institution in Philadelphia released 31 children in August and September 1874. Records stating relocated to suitable placements. A children's home in Ohio showed 23 children leaving between July and September with status listed as relocated by authority. The terminology varied slightly, but the pattern was consistent. Children leaving institutional care through some process described as relocation, documented minimally, without the kind of detail that adoptions or family reunifications or transfers to other institutions normally generated. These weren't informal arrangements made quietly. These were formal discharges recorded in official institution logs. But the documentation was deliberately vague about what relocation meant and where these children had gone. Compare this to how adoptions were documented in the same period, and the contrast becomes even more stark. When a child was adopted from an orphanage in the 1870s, the institution maintained extensive records showing the adopting family's full names and residential location. The legal process involved including court petitions and approvals where required, correspondence between institution and family, establishing the family's suitability and financial capability, and often even follow-up correspondence months or years later, checking on the child's welfare and adjustment. The paper trail was substantial and deliberate because adoption was a legal transfer of parental rights requiring documentation at multiple levels: institutional, legal, and often religious. Similarly, when children were transferred between institutions, from an orphanage to an industrial school for vocational training, or from one children's home to another due to age limits or specialized needs or geographic considerations, transfer records identified the receiving institution by name and location, included formal correspondence between administrators negotiating the transfer and establishing the receiving institution's capacity to care for the child, noted the specific reasons for transfer and any special needs or circumstances the child brought, and sometimes included acknowledgement receipts confirming the child had been received. And when children were reunified with families after parents recovered from illness or economic hardship, or when extended relatives were finally located, discharge records typically identified the family members taking custody with names and addresses, documented how the family connection was verified, and often noted conditions or recommendations for the child's continued care. These were thoroughly documented outcomes because institutions had legal responsibility for the children in their care and needed to prove to supervising state authorities and charitable funding sources that children were being discharged appropriately to situations that would provide ongoing care and supervision. But relocation didn't follow those documentation patterns. The children classified as relocated didn't have adopting families listed. They didn't have destination, institutions identified. They didn't have family members named as taking custody. They were simply relocated. The vagueness is the point. These children left institutional care through some organized process. The discharges happened in clusters, suggesting coordination, but the process was documented in ways that obscured rather than clarified what happened to them. Someone received these children. Someone took custody or responsibility. But the institutional records don't specify who or where, and that omission appears to be deliberate. The ages of relocated children cluster between approximately 8 and 14 years. Not infants who might be placed informally, not older adolescents who might be discharged to independent work situations. School-aged children, old enough to have established institutional records, old enough to remember their time in care, old enough to potentially maintain identity and testimony about their origins and experiences. Yet these were the children selected for relocation, children at ages where they'd be most capable of remembering and reporting what happened to them, but still young enough to be legally dependent and unable to resist or document their own removal from institutional care. The geographic pattern shows children being discharged from institutions in the Northeast and Midwest and classified as relocated, but there's minimal documentation of where they went. Some records include vague references to Western territories or agricultural placements or Christian households, but these descriptions don't provide enough specificity to trace the children forward. Western territories covered vast areas in 1874: Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. Agricultural placements could mean anything from legitimate farm families needing labor to exploitative situations. Christian households doesn't specify denomination, location, or family name. The descriptive language sounds like it's providing information, but actually provides nothing that would allow the children to be traced or located. Let me be specific about one: institutions records. An orphanage in Pennsylvania that I'll leave unnamed for ethical reasons discharged 31 children between August 15th and September 3rd, 1874. The discharge log shows all 31 listed as relocated to Western agricultural situations per coordinated arrangement with placement authorities. That sounds official and organized. But there's no list of families who received the children, no correspondence with placement authorities explaining the arrangement, no follow-up reports on how the children were adjusting. These 31 children, who had been in the orphanage's care with individual case files documenting their backgrounds and behaviors and needs, were collectively discharged within 3 weeks. Time equals 500 milliseconds greater than slash, and the only permanent record is that they were relocated west. Their individual case files, which should have contained discharge details, are either missing or heavily redacted in the archive where the institution's records are now held. The aggregate discharge log survives. The individual details don't. The timing is significant. The 1874 relocations happened during the same year when orphanages were admitting unusual numbers of children without birth documentation, the pattern I've documented elsewhere. Children entered institutional systems in spring and summer 1874 without clear origins. Some of those same institutions, or institutions in the same network, time equals 200 milliseconds / greater than discharged children in late summer and fall 1874 through this vague relocation process. It's possible these were completely separate populations. The children entering without documentation were different individuals from the children being relocated. But The timing suggests a connection. Children without documented origins entering institutions, children without documented destinations leaving institutions, both processes happening within months of each other, both involving administrative vagueness that breaks the normal documentary trail. There's a specific type of institutional arrangement in the 1870s that complicates this, the orphan train movement. Starting in the 1850s and continuing through the early 1900s, various charitable organizations placed urban orphans with rural families, primarily in western states. Children were transported by train in groups, placed with families who agreed to provide homes and labor opportunities. The orphan train system has been studied extensively by historians, and it involved real placements of real children with generally traceable outcomes. The system kept records, imperfect records, but records nonetheless, of which children went on which trains, which communities received them, which families took them. Follow-up was inconsistent, and many placements were exploitative, but the orphan train system was a documented phenomenon with identifiable participants. Pitched 2%. The 1874 relocations might have been part of orphan train placements. That's one possible explanation. Except orphan train records from the 1870s don't show a dramatic spike in placements in 1874, and the institutions I'm examining weren't all affiliated with the major orphan train organizations. Some were, some weren't. And critically, orphan train placements were usually documented with more specificity than the 1874 relocation show. The organizations running orphan trains needed to demonstrate they were placing children responsibly to maintain funding and public support. They kept lists of children, lists of receiving communities, reports on outcomes. The 1874 relocations don't have that documentation. They look more like children being removed from institutional records deliberately than like children being placed through documented charitable programs. What happened to children classified as relocated? I've tried to trace them forward through census records using names from admission logs and looking for matches in western states in the 1880 census. The success rate is extremely low. Some children with common names might be in the census but are impossible to verify as the same individuals. Some might have had their names changed in placement. Some might have died before the 1880 census. But the sheer number who seem to disappear completely from accessible records is striking. Out of the 81 children I can identify by name who were classified as relocated from institutions I've examined in 1874, I can tentatively trace perhaps 12 in later records with any confidence. That's a disappearance rate far exceeding what you'd expect, even accounting for name changes, death, and incomplete census data. Most of those 81 children vanished documentarily after their discharge in 1874. The institutions that conducted these relocations continued operating normally afterward. There's no indication of scandal or investigation. The relocations were apparently accepted by supervising authorities as legitimate discharges. State boards that oversaw orphanages and reviewed their operations don't seem to have questioned the vague documentation, which means either the authorities understood what relocation meant and accepted it as appropriate, or they didn't investigate closely enough to recognize the documentary gaps, or they investigated and decided not to pursue the matter. Any of these possibilities suggests institutional acquiescence to a process that removed children from traceable care situations without creating clear records of where they went. The children who were relocated. Who were they, really? Based on the fragmentary records that survive in institutional archives and the patterns visible across multiple institutions, they show remarkably similar characteristics to the children admitted without proper documentation in the same period. The children I've documented elsewhere who entered orphanage systems in 1874 with names but no birth records. Ages clustering in middle childhood, predominantly between 8 and 14 years old. Frequent notations in institutional case files about unusual background or uncertain origins or no family. Contacts established despite institutional efforts or attempts to locate relatives unsuccessful. Behavioral descriptions in daily logs and staff reports suggesting children who didn't integrate smoothly into institutional routines, not necessarily disruptive in the sense of violent or destructive behavior, but described using language like resistant to standard instruction or maintaining inappropriate expectations about conditions, or displaying knowledge inconsistent with claimed background, or failing to adapt to institutional culture despite adequate time for adjustment. These are the same kinds of carefully worded administrative language that institutions used throughout this period to describe children who didn't fit institutional norms smoothly, who raised questions among staff, who were problematic not because of bad behavior in conventional senses, but because of who they were fundamentally or what they represented, or what uncomfortable questions their presence raised about where they'd actually come from, and why they couldn't provide verifiable information about their origins and families. Consider the operational logistics. Moving 20 or 30 children from an institution in Pennsylvania to unspecified locations in the West required coordination. Transportation arrangements. Adult supervision during travel, receiving parties at destinations, food and lodging during transit, money to pay for all of this. These weren't informal, impromptu relocations. Someone organized them, funded them, coordinated with whoever was receiving the children at the other end. But that organizational infrastructure isn't documented in institutional records. No invoices for train tickets, no correspondence with Western authorities or families, no reports from staff who accompanied the children. The logistics that would have been necessary are absent from the archive. Either those records were never created, which seems unlikely for institutions that maintained detailed financial accounting, or they were created and subsequently removed or restricted. The possibility that troubles me most is that relocation wasn't relocation in the geographic sense of placement elsewhere. It was a euphemism, administrative language that sounded benign but masked something darker. Children classified as relocated weren't sent to new homes or even to exploitative labor situations in the West. They were removed permanently through means that couldn't be documented straightforwardly in institutional records that were subject to audit and public scrutiny. Institutional death records from this period sometimes show patterns that raise questions. An orphanage relocates 27 children in fall 1874, and the following winter shows mortality rates 40% above the previous year's average among the children who remained. Correlation isn't causation. Many factors could explain elevated mortality, including epidemic disease, harsh weather, economic constraints affecting food quality. But it raises uncomfortable questions. Were some children classified as relocated actually children who died, and their deaths were recorded differently to keep institutional mortality statistics from appearing catastrophically high? Or did mortality increase among the remaining population due to disease introduced during the chaos and disruption of mass relocations when children were prepared for departure and institutions were reorganizing? Or did the institutional environment worsen in material ways, reduced staffing, decreased food quality, compromised sanitation, after the relocations occurred, perhaps because resources had been diverted to funding the relocation process? Any of these would explain mortality spikes following relocations. None of them are comforting. And all of them suggest that relocation, as documented in institutional records, may have been more complex and darker than the simple administrative term implies. Another possibility, relocation meant transfer to institutions that didn't maintain records the same way or whose records aren't accessible. Asylums for the mentally ill, industrial schools with different reporting structures, county poorhouses that had minimal documentation requirements, institutions in territories that weren't yet states and whose record-keeping systems were less developed. If children classified as relocated were actually transferred to these types of facilities, it would explain why they disappear from orphanage records but don't appear in adoption records or family reunifications. They remained institutionalized but in different types of institutions, and those institutions either didn't survive with their records intact or maintained records in ways that make the children unidentifiable to researchers 150 years later. The Tartarian framework provides the most coherent explanation for this entire pattern, connecting the 1874 relocations to the broader context of systematic population management happening throughout the 1860s to 1880s. If 1874 was a critical year in the process of absorbing and erasing remnant populations from the displaced prior civilization, children from that erased civilization being collected into institutions where their origins could be obscured and their problematic knowledge could be contained. Then, by late 1874, several months after the initial wave of admissions, some of those children would need to be moved again for various operational and security reasons. Perhaps because they were too old and too articulate about their actual origins to remain safely in mainstream orphanages where they might influence other children with their stories or be observed and questioned by charitable visitors and benefactors who toured institutions regularly. Perhaps because institutions couldn't sustainably handle the numbers admitted earlier in the year during the concentrated admission period. Time equals 500 milliseconds / greater than, and needed to reduce populations to manageable levels before winter when resources would be strained. Perhaps because the children represented particular categories, children who were especially resistant to institutional control, children whose knowledge or abilities were especially anomalous, children whose physical appearance or characteristics were especially difficult to explain within acceptable narratives that required different forms of containment than standard orphanages could provide. Whatever the specific operational reasons driving the decisions, the children needed to be relocated. Sent to more remote locations where oversight was minimal, to more controlled environments where their presence wouldn't be visible to external observers, to places where their problematic knowledge or origins wouldn't be accessible to scrutiny from researchers or reformers or journalists. And critically, the documentation was deliberately vague, not through incompetence or resource constraints, but because specificity would create trails that could be followed decades or centuries later, questions that could be asked by descendants or historians, children who could potentially be located, and whose descendants might carry forward family stories about anomalous origins or experiences that contradicted official historical narratives. The administrative language of relocation masks violence. Not necessarily physical violence, though that's possible. But structural violence, the violence of severing children from any stable connection, of moving them to unknown locations without their consent or their ability to maintain contact with anyone who knew them, of documentation that ensured they'd be permanently unlocatable. These children existed in institutional care with names and case files and daily records. Then they were classified as relocated and ceased to exist documentarily in any traceable way. That's erasure accomplished through bureaucratic procedure. The children weren't killed, or not all of them, not necessarily. But they were removed from all systems that would allow them to be found, known, or remembered as individuals. Time equals 1.8 seconds / greater than relocated meant made to disappear into documentation gaps from which they couldn't emerge. Some children classified as relocated probably did find legitimate placements with families who provided reasonable care. The orphan train system, for all its flaws, did result in some positive outcomes for some children. It's possible that many of the 1874 relocations were simply poorly documented versions of that process, and the children who seemed to vanish from records actually just integrated into families under new names in places where they aren't easily traceable. That's the most benign interpretation. But it requires accepting that institutions that normally maintained meticulous records suddenly became sloppy about documentation specifically for these relocations. That supervising authorities who normally audited child welfare placements didn't question the vague documentation. That hundreds of children could be sent west and successfully placed without generating the kind of follow-up correspondence and reporting that characterized most placements. All of that is possible. But it requires stacking multiple unlikely things on top of each other to avoid the simpler explanation that the documentation was vague because the relocations weren't meant to be traceable. The pattern diminishes after 1875. Discharge records from orphanages in 1876 and 1877 still show some children classified as relocated, but the numbers are much lower and the documentation is slightly more specific. By the 1880s, vague relocations are rare in the records I've examined. Instead, discharges follow the standard patterns: adoptions with families named, transfers with institutions identified, reunifications with family members specified. Whatever was happening in 1874 that produced mass relocations with minimal documentation had ended or changed form. The children discharged in those years were gone. The process that removed them had concluded. And by the 1880s, institutional child welfare was operating according to more conventional procedures with more conventional documentation. The unusual window closed. The children who passed through it remained lost. The institutions that conducted these relocations have descendants, modern child welfare agencies that trace their organizational lineage back to 19th century orphanages. Some of those historical records are in the archives of those successor organizations. Some are in state archives or historical societies. Access varies. Some institutions have been cooperative with researchers. Others restrict access to historical case files citing privacy concerns, even for individuals who would be dead now. The records that are accessible often show the patterns I've described: normal documentation for most children, vague documentation for children classified as relocated in 1874. The records that aren't accessible, one has to wonder if they contain more details about the relocations or if they show the same documentary gaps. Are the restrictions protecting privacy of long-dead children, or protecting institutional reputation by controlling access to evidence of practices that wouldn't withstand modern scrutiny? The children classified as relocated in 1874 had names. They had individual identities documented in admission logs and case files. They were real children who lived in specific institutions at specific times. Then they were administratively removed from traceable existence through a process described only as relocation. Some may have found good homes and lived full lives under new identities in the American West. Some may have died in institutional care or shortly after under circumstances that weren't properly documented. Some may have been absorbed into other institutional systems where they remained until death. Some may have been removed in ways that can't be stated explicitly without evidence, but that the pattern of absence suggests. All of these are possible. The documentation doesn't exist to prove what actually happened. And that absence of documentation appears to be the point, to make these children's fates irrecoverable, to ensure that the process of relocation broke any trail that might lead back to who they were, where they came from, or what became of them. Relocated. Filed away. Gone. Not just from the institutions that once held them, but from the historical record that would normally preserve at least minimal traces of their existence. The children sent away in 1874 were sent into documentary oblivion, classified with a bureaucratic term that sounds benign but functioned as erasure.